Shalom Aleichem and welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs, and as always, it's my delight and pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program, Letters from the Afterlife, the Post-Holocaust Correspondence of Chava Rosenfarb and Zenia Larsson with Goldie Morgentaler. Before we get started, a few housekeeping details. You may send us your questions via the question panel located at the lower right of your screen. We ask that you refrain from sending comments and keep questions short so we can try to get to all of them this evening. Goldie Morgentaler is professor emerita at the University of Lethbridge and an award-winning translator from Yiddish to English. She received the Canadian Jewish Literary Award in 2024 for her translation of In the Land of the Postscript, the complete short stories of Chava Rosenfarb. Welcome, Goldie. Always a pleasure to have you here to talk about one of your many, many projects and works in translation, the latest being Letters from the Afterlife. And before we get started, a huge and hearty congratulations to you from everybody at the Yiddish Book Center. Another important and wonderfully, beautifully translated book by you. So eager to hear your presentation. So off the screen with me and on with you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And Shana Tova to everyone. That's Chava and Zenia. So this past June, I published an exchange of letters between my mother, the Yiddish writer Chava Rosenfarb, and her best friend from childhood, the Swedish novelist Zenia Larsson. And next slide, please. So I published this collection with some trepidation, given that we are living in an age that is seeing the death of letters, and this is a collection of letters. And as if to prove my point, just about an hour or so ago, it was announced here in Toronto that Canada Post, our mail carrier, they're going on strike throughout the country. So when I said the death of letters, I was more correct than I knew. And by letters here, I mean lengthy, personal, often handwritten communications of the kind that people used to exchange before the advent of computers and email, before telephones and instant communication represented the only way to keep in touch with family and friends, with lovers, with enemies, with business companions, etc. Emails and texts certainly don't quite cut it the same way as letters do, and they are ephemeral. Speaking personally, I've always loved reading letters, other people's letters, and I've always hated writing my own. Letters capture history on the fly, more or less as it is happening. As historical documents, there is nothing quite like them. And for anyone interested in the lives of other people, in human interactions, which is a fancy way of saying gossip, actually, they are without parallel. They require a certain level of literacy, the ability to convey information on the page in a coherent fashion. So it is no wonder that writers in particular, in addition to whatever else they are currently working on, writers have always seemed to find time to write letters. Which brings me to my mother and her best friend, Zenia Larsson, and their exchange of letters beginning at the end of 1945, just a few months after the two women's liberation at Bergen-Belsen in April of the previous year. My mother was a Yiddish language novelist, as I'm sure many of you know, Chava Rosenfarb, whose novels are now mostly available in English. Can I have the next slide, please? That's her. This is her best known novel. Her best friend from childhood was Zenia Larsson, née Marcinkowska, who became a well-known novelist in Sweden in the middle decades of the 20th century. And the next slide, please. The idea for this book began as I was going through my mother's papers after her death in January 2011. What I found there was something quite strange. It was a stash of letters in Polish. And could you get next slide, please? Just to give you a sense of what they looked like. Why was it strange? Because these were not, as might be expected, Zenia's letters to Chava, but rather Chava's own letters to Zenia. So there is one particular peculiarity of traditional letters that I didn't mention before, namely that they are always, frustratingly, the property of the recipient. The minute your letters are mailed, they are no longer yours. So here lay a mystery. What were Chava's own letters doing among her papers? I had heard about my mother's friend Zenia all my life, although I knew very little about her. I did know that she lived in Sweden. I also sensed that in Zenia's return of Chava's letters, there lay a story, but it took me a while to tease it out. The first of the letters was dated December 1945. That is 8 months, 8 months after the two women's liberation in Bergen-Belsen in April of 1945. And the last letter in this book is dated 1971. Zenia's original letters to Chava, obviously I do not have, but what I did have was the book that Zenia published in Swedish called, and I'm not even going to try to do the Swedish title. In English, it's Letters from a New Reality. Can I have the next slide, please? This book gives only Zenia's side of the correspondence, translated by herself from Polish into Swedish. Since I now had the two sets of letters, albeit in different forms and in two different languages, it occurred to me that if I put them together, they might form a coherent back and forth, as well as a picture of what life was like for two Holocaust survivors who lived their afterlives in two different countries. It seemed to me, too, that the fact that the correspondents were women made the letters unusual, since I am not aware of other published sets of letters between women Holocaust survivors that describe their lives after the war. But there was a problem. All the original correspondence between the two women was in Polish. Unlike Chava, Zenia never went to a Yiddish language day school in Lodz, their hometown. So while she understood Yiddish and could read it, she was far more comfortable writing in Polish. In order to publish her book, she translated her own letters from Polish into Swedish. Since I know neither Polish nor Swedish, I had to have Chava's and Zenia's letters translated into English. It took a bit of doing, but I was eventually lucky enough to find two excellent translators, Krzysztof Mehr from Polish to English and Sylvia Soderlund from Swedish to English. I am enormously grateful to them both, because without their work, I would never have known the full story of this friendship, nor, incidentally, the story of my own early life. In effect, the translation, especially of my mother's letters, has righted my memories and restored to me my own past, as seen from the intimate point of view of my mother. The need for translation also underlines the complicated linguistic reality of what many Holocaust survivors lived, in which many Holocaust survivors lived after the war, and which also determined the literary fates of the two women writers. The multilingual universe of European Holocaust survivors also affects the children of the survivors, like myself, whose main language of communication is often not that of their parents. For instance, I met Zenia only once in Mallorca when I was a teenager on a trip to Europe with my parents. Next slide, please. That's my brother at the left, and I'm next, and then my mother, Zenia's husband, Zenia on the right, and then my father. And this is the meeting in Mallorca. I remember Zenia as a dark, slight, rather fragile-looking woman to whom I could not speak because she did not know English, and her Yiddish, another language that we might have had in common, was long forgotten. Her Swedish husband made a greater impression on me because his English was fluent and we could converse. An example of how even memory has its linguistic component. A few more words about the two women. As I said, they had been friends since girlhood, even though they did not go to the same school. But their parents were Bundists, members of the Jewish Socialist Party that had a huge following among Polish Jews in the period between the two world wars. It was their parents' Bundism that originally forged the link between the two young women, but it was their shared love of literature that cemented their friendship. As adolescents, both young women had dreams of being writers when they grew up. But fate intervened. In 1939, war broke out. The German armies marched into Poland and began a reign of terror. In Lodz, they set up a ghetto that was hermetically sealed and surrounded by barbed wire. Next slide, please. This is the bridge that connected the two sides of the Lodz Ghetto. And I don't know if you can make it out, but along both sides of the street, there is barbed wire. And underneath, life goes on as usual. There's a tram, but there are also the German soldiers. Chava, Zenia, and their families were incarcerated in this ghetto, in the Lodz Ghetto. They managed to survive despite hunger, disease, and constant deportations to the death camps. In fact, they survived almost until the final liquidation of the ghetto in August 1944, when the remaining Jews of Lodz were packed onto railway cars and sent off to Auschwitz. From Auschwitz, Chava's mother and sister, Zenia, and Zenia's stepmother were sent to a forced labor camp at Zazel outside Hamburg. Have the next slide, please. And you can see Lodz at the middle left of the map. They went from Lodz down to Oświęcim. I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong, which is Auschwitz, right? It's the Polish name for Auschwitz. And then they were transported to a forced labor camp at Zazel. And finally, they ended up at Bergen-Belsen. They were liberated at Bergen-Belsen by the British Army in April 1945. Next slide, please. These are women at Bergen-Belsen who had just days after the liberation. And it is at Bergen-Belsen that the two friends who had been inseparable until then, this is where they parted, when Zenia decided to accept a Swedish government offer of asylum and moved to Sweden. Chava stayed in Germany to search for her father and her boyfriend, Goldie Morgentaler, both of whom were rumored to still be alive. In her book, Letters from a New Reality, Zenia explained her decision to leave Chava and Chava's family behind as follows. I could not manage the togetherness any longer, nor did I myself have anything to search for. I suspect that Zenia also had other reasons for wanting to leave the past behind, a past that Chava clearly represented for her, namely the wish to forget the horrors of what had just happened to her, as well as envy at Chava's luck, you put it in quotation mark, if I may use such a word without irony in this context. Chava was luckier than Zenia in that her immediate family, that is, her mother and her younger sister Henya, although not her father, had also survived the war. What's more, her boyfriend from the school days, Henrik Morgentaler, had also survived. Chava was not left utterly alone in the world the way Zenia was. Zenia's departure for Sweden would initiate the correspondence between the two friends, a correspondence that would last for 50 years, and a part of which is reproduced in Letters from the Afterlife. The earliest letters and the most numerous, date from the 5-year period immediately after the war, when Zenia is in Sweden and Chava is in Brussels. The first letter is written by Chava in December 1945. Chava, her mother and sister Henya, had just settled in Brussels after crossing the border illegally into Belgium. Chava begins by chastising Zenia for not writing to her, even though Zenia had had Chava's Brussels address. She declares that she is punishing Zenia for the delay by delaying writing herself. I find Zenia's emotional response to this reproach quite moving. She writes, and I quote, "Don't you remember what I said to you in Bergen-Belsen when my journey to Sweden was already decided? I told you then that as long as you remain in Germany, I will not write to you. I will not write to Germany. When I left Bergen-Belsen, it was with a firm determination to draw a line over my whole past, forget everything and begin anew. It has not been possible. The past returns." And that's the end of the quote. And it's this last part that always makes me cry, because I think it's true. The past returns. Zenia was not the only Holocaust survivor of my acquaintance who tried to forget the immediate past, who tried to erase it in order to go on with the future and to pretend that it didn't happen. My own father did the same, with devastating results for my mother, who could not forget what had happened and who wrote about it in her novels. But I will return to that in a minute. Not surprisingly, given that these are letters exchanged between two young women in their early 20s, romance looms large as a topic. Zenia describes several potential suitors, most of whom she meets through contacts in the Jewish community of Stockholm. None of these men appeals to her. But then, through friends of friends, she meets Per-Axel Larsson, the young man who will become her husband. One of the most touching letters in this collection contains Zenia's plea to Chava to absolve her of the guilt she feels for loving a non-Jew. And this is a quote. "If I lived with him," she writes, "would it be a sin? Are my feelings for him a crime against my loved ones who perished because they were Jews? Write to me, Eva's Chava. Perhaps it will help me to see more clearly." Chava, who in an earlier letter had expressed skepticism about the wisdom of marrying a non-Jew, now replies to Zenia that she must follow the dictates of her heart. If she loves Per-Axel, then she must do what feels right, regardless of whether or not he is Jewish. Next slide, please. In contrast to Zenia's many boyfriends, Chava has only one, Henrik Morgentaler. Later in Canada, he anglicized his first name to Henry. In her very first letter to Zenia, Chava is anxiously waiting for him to join her in Brussels. He had remained in Germany after his liberation from Dachau to study medicine. The plan had been for him to join Chava in Brussels, but the fact that he delays and does not write is making her anxious. After a long wait, Henrik does indeed join Chava in Brussels, and they begin their life together. In 5 years' time, in order to immigrate to Canada, he will officially become her husband. Several months after they arrive in Montreal, he will become my father. But as yet, in the first year of her correspondence with Zenia, Chava is waiting for him to join her in Brussels. He was supposed to have come earlier, she tells Zenia, but for unspecified reasons, he has been delayed, and she is beside herself with worry. During a recent interview that I gave about this book, I was asked if there was anything about these letters that surprised me. I had to think a minute because there had been several things that surprised me. But what had perhaps surprised me the most in the early correspondence was the intensity of my mother's love for my father. My parents had had a very difficult marriage, and Chava's letters to Zenia do eventually reveal this, although she spends a lot of time in her later letters trying to hide the truth of what was happening in her life vis-a-vis her marriage. But in the early years, right after Chava learned that Henrik had survived the war, she longed for him with an intensity that took me by surprise. The ardor of her love certainly was related to her youth at the time, and I might add to her inability to think badly of the people whom she loved. This inability is on full display throughout the years covered by the letters, when she writes only to praise him, although if one reads between the lines, it becomes clear that she is deeply unhappy in her marriage. My parents' love affair had begun as puppy love when they were both children and sitting on the same bench in elementary school, competing for the same prizes. Henrik had proposed to Chava in a Lodz cinema when they were both 14, something else that I had not known until I read these letters. As I said, Chava had a loyal soul, and despite the fact that they were both so young when he proposed, she obviously took the proposal very seriously. Much more seriously than he did, I am sure. Her heart was his from then on. When I first read the translations of these letters, I was surprised at how blind Chava seemed to be to Henrik's faults. The very fact that he delayed coming to her, despite their agreement, and despite knowing that she was waiting for him in Brussels, the very fact that what finally motivated him to join her were rumors that reached him that she was being courted by another man. To me, these should have been red flags that did not bode well for the future. But Chava ignores them, and I cannot go back in time to shake her and make her aware of what the future holds. The photos I have of her at the time of her young marriage vividly portray how happy she was in the early years before my parents moved to Canada. Next slide, please. These are photos taken in Brussels, and the next slide as well. And I don't know if you can make out, but there is a photo of Zenia on the mantelpiece at the left. Many of the early letters from both Chava and Zenia are suffused with a vague malaise and a sense of alienation. In their correspondence, the women do not touch often on their shared experiences during the war, but both Chava and Zenia seem to suffer from an unarticulated depression that expresses itself in a variety of unexplained physical ailments. For instance, Chava writes that she has been running a low-grade fever ever since she arrived in Brussels, which causes her to frequently take to her bed. But the malady causing this fever is not explained. Both women zigzag between emotions of elation at their newfound freedom and feelings of anxiety and depression. Zenia lost her beloved stepmother, Eva, in the aftermath of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. Aside from an uncle in Paraguay, she has no other family. I am totally, utterly alone, she writes in one of her first letters to Chava. When she trips and falls while crossing a busy Stockholm street and is nearly run over by a car, she writes that it would have been better if the driver had not braked in time, because there is no one to know that she is gone and no one to mourn her. She writes, and I quote, "In order to live, people need some kind of stable ground under their feet, a bit of warmth, a home. But with me, my home is floating somewhere in the air." That's the end of the quote. Also, because she left Bergen-Belsen DP camp as part of a Swedish government initiative to resettle Holocaust survivors, Zenia was kept for several weeks in quarantine in a detention camp in a small town in northern Sweden. And as she writes, she was imprisoned again after first being subjected to all kinds of baths and disinfections, and only after thorough medical exams, finally allowed to settle in Sweden. Her letters to Chava are full of worry about fitting into her new country. She is 23 years old when she arrives in 1945. She needs to learn Swedish, but there are no Swedish language classes for the new arrivals. She must find a job to support herself. The only jobs on offer are factory work, house cleaning, or working as a hospital orderly. There is no understanding of her wish to continue her schooling. In the meantime, she is utterly alone and without resources. She washes dishes to make money. She does odd jobs, but what she really wants is to study sculpture. She applies to the Swedish Academy of Art and is turned down. The Academy only accepts 3 applicants out of 100. They think she is talented, but not yet ready. Moreover, she doesn't speak Swedish. How will she understand the instruction? It will take another attempt before she is admitted. Next slide, please. Living in Brussels, Chava is also unsettled. Not only is she waiting for Henrik, but unlike Zenia, she is stateless, a cause of great anxiety. During the period from December 1945, when the first letters are exchanged, until 1950, when she leaves for Canada, Chava and her family are living illegally in Belgium. They have no right to remain and must emigrate in 5 years. Where should they go? What country will take them? Plans to go to Germany, to Argentina, to the United States come to nothing. Both women suffer from survivor's guilt. Zenia torments herself for not having done more to prevent the suicide of her father in the ghetto, or the death of her beloved stepmother, Eva, who died just days after the liberation from eating tins of fatty meat distributed by the British forces that liberated Bergen-Belsen. For her part, Chava writes of her guilt at not comforting the poet Simcha Bunim Shayevich when they were both in the cattle cars on the way to Auschwitz. Shayevich had been in love with her. He wanted just one comforting word, Chava writes, and I refused to give it to him. I cannot forgive myself. Shayevich was one of the last to be sent to the gas chamber at Camp Kaufering, a subcamp of Dachau. Chava also harbors what she calls a secret guilt with regard to Zenia, although her reasons are vague. Zenia responds, "You write that during the war, you often left me to my fate. You forgot me and let me struggle on alone. Perhaps you did at times, but that is not the whole truth." She then reminds Chava of the incident in the Sazo labor camp when a capo slapped Zenia as the women inmates were scrambling for their ration of soup. Without thinking, Chava slapped the capo across the face. In return, an act of disobedience so serious that it could have resulted in Chava's being sent to the gas chamber. Instead, the slap brought the capo back to a sense of her own morality. After a day's reflection, during which Chava was separated from the others in the barrack, the capo relented. "You were right to slap me," she told Chava. "I have turned into an animal." And of course, that slap was made to protect Zenia. From that time on, Chava, her mother, sister, Zenia, and Zenia's stepmother received an extra ration of soup every day. And this is the incident that inspired one of Chava's most complex short stories, Edja's Revenge, which is told from the point of view of a capo like the one who basically saved Chava's life. Next slide, please. That story is part of the collection In the Land of the Postscript published by White Goat Press. As time goes on, the focus of the letters shifts away from the war. Both women had literary ambitions when they were young, and they continued to inquire about each other's creativity. They are also very aware of the problems of being female in the mid-20th century and wanting to lead a fulfilled yet independent and creative life. Both women were budding feminists in their youth when they formed the Free Women's Club, which had the two of them only as its members. But now that they were older, the difficulties of leading a creative life and still being fulfilled as a woman loomed even larger. Zenia wants to become a sculptor. After a second try, she is admitted to the Academy of Art and does very well, but she finds it hard to make a living. There is a prejudice against women sculptors, and she does not get many commissions. Can I have the next slide, please? This is Zenia at work, and the next slide. The next slide. Yeah, I included this because I love it. I think it's beautiful. Instead of sculpture, Zenia turns to writing. Chava, for her part, worries constantly about becoming pregnant. A baby would be a terrible calamity at this stage in her life. Neither she nor Henrik is making enough money to support a child. And then there's the problem that she would have even less time for creative work. These are the kinds of issues that many ambitious women have faced. What differentiates Zenia and Chava from others like them is that the experiences they have lived through in the war make creativity an imperative as a way of exercising and coming to terms with the past. When Chava moves to Canada in 1950, the correspondence between the two women becomes more erratic. Of the two, Chava is the more diligent letter writer. When Zenia delays her answers, Chava responds with reproaches couched in expressions of worry about Zenia's health or emotional well-being. When it is Chava who does not answer, Zenia does exactly the same. In fact, the letters often take on a tone of grievance better suited to lovers than to friends. Each, at one point or another, speaks of punishing the other for her silence. Zenia learns that she cannot have children, which is a severe blow. To fill the void, she and Per Axel adopt a persnickety dachshund, and many of Zenia's letters from this period are taken up with descriptions of the dog's doings, possibly as a counter to Chava's rapturous descriptions of her new motherhood. Next slide, please. One reason, this is Zenia obviously in her workroom with the dog. One reason for the dilatory nature of the letters is that independently and almost simultaneously, both women begin to write about their experiences during the Holocaust, and both choose fiction as a way of recreating the past. Curiously, they both conceive of their novels in 3 volumes. For both, the novels serve both as an exorcism and as a memorial to the lost community of Jews that they knew. Zenia writes her novels directly in Swedish because she dislikes Polish, although it is her first language, but it reminds her too much of the past. However, Swedish is a language that she only learned as an adult without formal instruction, so she never feels that she has mastered it. It is her husband, Per Axel, who corrects her Swedish, retypes her manuscripts, argues with her over words and phrases, and generally plays the role of editor, translator, and critic. Zenia envies Chava the ability to write in Yiddish. She writes, "What a thing it is to have a mother tongue at your disposal, to own your language." I just lost my place. What a thing it is to have a mother tongue at your disposal, to own your language and use it as an instrument that you have mastered. Here I sit down at the typewriter, hopelessly aware of my linguistic homelessness. When Zenia announces the publication of her novel in 1961, Chava writes, "Who could have imagined this, that you will one day write something and I will be unable to read it? Such are the consequences of the whole chaos that we lived through." The consequences are more serious than either of them realizes. Chava may have an advantage in being able to write in her mother tongue of Yiddish, but it is Zenia who, from a reputational point of view, is more successful. Because it is in Swedish, Zenia's trilogy is accessible to non-Jewish Scandinavians, one of whom, the celebrated Norwegian author Johan Borgen, writes a rave review of the first volume of Zenia's trilogy in the pages of Expressen, Sweden's largest newspaper. From then on, Zenia's books will become known to the Swedish public, who value them as a testament to the recent past, and turn Zenia Larsson into an important literary figure in Sweden. In contrast, because of troubles in her own life, the breakdown of her marriage, the need to raise 2 children, Chava's novel, which was begun in Brussels in the late 1940s, will not be published until 1971, and then only in Yiddish. And because it is written in Yiddish, it is accessible only to Jews, and then only to those Jews who know Yiddish. The publication of The Tree of Life was treated as a major event in the Yiddish-speaking world, and its author was flooded with fan mail and showered with prizes. But knowledge of the novel's existence remained within this relatively small community. Chava could not find a publisher for the English translation until 1985, nearly 15 years after its Yiddish publication. Zenia's trilogy, on the other hand, while enjoying a large readership in Sweden, was never translated into English, and so ironically has fallen into even greater obscurity today than Chava's Tree of Life, which was eventually published in English, Hebrew, and Polish translations. So what else can I tell you about the letters? Well, for one thing, they are full of references to Jewish literary figures passing through Sweden, many more than I would ever have imagined. Some well-known, like Elie Wiesel, and some less so. The letters are also full of references to contemporary politics. Zenia mentions seeing more and more of her Bundist comrades leaving for what was then Palestine. The most important political movement for both women had been the Bund. When they discuss the party, it is the Bund they mean. But in 1948, Zenia announces that she has left the Bund and is leaning more and more towards Zionism. Chava, who had been very active in the Bund in Brussels, is shocked. But she too will eventually distance herself from the Bund, although she maintains a lifelong emotional attachment to it. Despite disagreements over politics and complaints of neglect, the correspondence makes clear how important each woman was to the other. The repeated expressions of affection, the endearments, the constant reaffirmations of love reflect the effusive Jewish culture of Eastern Europe, from which both women sprang, as well as the trauma of their shared histories. Yet, despite the obvious affection between them, the friendship almost broke apart when Zenia sent Chava back her letters without explanation, and then asked Chava for the return of her own letters. Zenia gave no reason for returning Chava's letters, nor for the request that Chava return Zenia's own letters. Chava was shocked and deeply hurt, but she complied. I am very glad that she did. Otherwise, this book would never have existed. I will leave you to discover on your own what happened to the friendship after this apparent rupture. But I do hope that I've said enough to whet your appetites to read this book of letters for yourselves. And I will leave you now with a photo of one of my favorite sculptures by Zenia. Last slide, please. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Goldie. Really an amazing story brought to life through these letters. I'm going to start with a question. Was it personally difficult for you to read these letters of your mother's?
I'm personally difficult. Not really. I wouldn't say so. No. there are letters that deal with me. And some of my health issues. And I actually was fascinated because you know what you yourself lived through, but you don't know what it looks like from the outside for someone else, and especially in this case, a mother. So I had a lot of trouble with my back when I was young, and that comes up in the letters. And I found it interesting. It also gave me a bit of distance from my own memories of that time period. But I wouldn't say it was difficult. I say it was it excited me. It was like going on on a research tour of my own life in a sense.
I guess it's the regret one has when they lose parents is I should have asked them questions.
That's right.
And here you have so much. Um, Apologies from this person, if I came in a little bit late, but I was curious who originated this correspondence, who started it, I think is what they're asking.
It was my mother. As I think I said at the beginning of the talk, my mother writes to Zenia to complain that Zenia has not written to her yet because she's been in Brussels waiting to hear, and Zenia has not written. And Zenia replies, well, what did you expect? I told you I was not going to write to you in Germany. And my mother just come into Brussels. So it was my mother.
Um, were these letters available in English? They are now. Yeah,
There.
they are now. Be- uh, your mother got her letters back. How did you acquire the letters that Chava sent to Zenia? Sorry, I'm terrible at pronouncing her name. Zenia, the ones that Zenia wrote.
I did, as I said, I didn't acquire them, and I don't have them. But Zenia published a book of her own side of the correspondence in Swedish. And that was why I needed two translators, because it occurred to me that if I put together my mother's letters and then the corresponding answer in Zenia's book, I would
Mm-hmm.
have something that would work as a letter and a reply and back and forth. And that actually turned out to be the case. But I needed the book is published. They are in a published book. I don't have the letters.
Um, this participant says, I get the feeling that Zenia is loved by you as well as your mother.
To tell you the truth, I knew very little about her, and I didn't. So I loved her as my mother's friend. I think that's fair. I came to love her, and I admire her work. What I've seen of it, I haven't seen a lot, but the little I was sent photographs. There was an Ausstellung. Oh, how do you say that in English? A show of
Mhm.
Zenia sculptures in Lodz. I think a year or so ago, curated by Ulla Chinoviec, who lives in Sweden and brought the sculptures to Lodz. In any case, and they sent me photographs, and that was really the first I saw of Zenia's, except for this. This is Zenia's a present by Zenia to my mother of a sculpture that she made.
Wow. How much of this story and the friendship did your mother share with you?
I knew about Zenia a lot. My mother talked about her a lot. I think it's clear that the two women meant a lot to each other, and especially given that they went through the war together.
Mhm.
They were together all the time, and which maybe is why Zenia wanted to separate. But at one point in the letters, Zenia reminds Chava, I was one of the five. Do you remember? And the five are the Nazis made the women march five across when they marched to work. And Zenia and my mother's mother and my aunt and Zenia's stepmother, they were the five, and they were always together. And then I think that's what helped them also to survive.
I have to just toss in here when you read the bit, nor did I have anything to search for. You just feel her loss, and
Yeah.
while your mother is searching for her family, and and it knows that they're alive, that the differences between their lives after is just profoundly hard to cope with. And your mother was there for her as a support system.
She was, but she also wasn't. I mean, and it was Zenia's choice. I mean, if they had been in the same, if Zenia hadn't decided to go to Sweden, they would have been together, and then they would have been a support for each other. But my mother is not happy about the fact that Zenia left, clearly. But with time, they got used to living apart. But I think from Zenia's point of view, I think she wanted to start over. That much is clear. She says that, actually. So they write letters to each other, but I think letters are not quite the same as having a good friend close by whom you can sort of go to whenever you need to. And they each complain about that very often in the letters.
Um, uh, Someone's asking if Zhenya's sculptures are in any museums in Stockholm.
I don't think they're in museums. I think I sort of vaguely remember hearing something about an exhibit in Stockholm, but if there is one, I don't know anything about it. They should be. So I think some of them are really quite beautiful.
In your opinion, is any character in Chava's trilogy based on Zhenya?
Oh, that's a very good question, and I have wondered about that myself. So um I just finished translating my mother's last novel, which is much more autobiographical. And even there, I would be hard pressed to tell you which character corresponds to Zhenya. I can't. My mother also had her sister with her, and she and her sister are fairly close in age. So it's hard to know if she's describing Zhenya or if she's describing her sister, as when she describes female friends. So and one thing I have always regretted is I don't read Swedish, and Zhenya's novel about the Lodz Ghetto was not translated into English, and I would love to know if my mother is in there. So, but as a character in the Tree of Life, there are so many characters that could have been based on Zhenya. So I don't know. I can't single one out.
And again, we have an apologies if answered already. A few people did come on a little bit late. Are you in touch with any remaining people who knew or were related to Zhenya?
Um, so Zhenya had she had no relatives, right? She had no children. And so I'm not in touch with her husband's family. So the answer to that is no. But I originally published this as an article in Tablet. And that one of the women who's from Poland, Ula, teaching at Lund University, she got interested in a whole story with Zhenya, and she found I had been looking for, I was tearing my hair, looking for what happened to Zhenya's papers after her death. She died before my mother, like 2, 3 years before, and I could not find her papers. And what's strange about that is that we're talking about a writer, and writers usually leave their papers to a library, to a university, to an archive somewhere. I called every single library I could think of in Sweden. And finally, I enlisted my cousin who lives in Stockholm. He called everywhere, and he finally had the brilliant idea. I needed permission also because I am quoting from a book, or Swedish Zenia's book. I need to know who owns the rights.
Mm.
So my cousin said Swedish wills are online now, and he looked it up. So he found who had permission, like who had. So that was a big help. but the letters I could not find. I could not find. My cousin did research, and finally it turned out that Zenia had left her papers, and if anyone is listening, do not do this. This is not smart. To two very good friends, and sort of separated. And the two very good friends who were Zenia's age eventually died. The papers were left upstairs in attics. And the children of the friends did not look for them until they could bring up, they got over grief at the loss of their parents. Finally, they found Zenia's archive. So it is now found. I have a feeling I lost track of the original question. But anyway, that's so Zenia's papers have been found, I guess is what I would end with.
You mentioned that your mother's trilogy served as an exorcism of the atrocities she and other Jews had lived. Perhaps this is too personal, but did your mother ever get the healing she needed as a Holocaust survivor?
I could not answer that. She would have to answer that. I think she did, in the sense of that she wrote it out of her system. And I guess I mentioned that my father refused to confront. He wanted to pretend that nothing had happened. And of the two attitudes, so I personally think that the way you deal with trauma is an individual, and we all deal with it in different ways. But the fact that my father made my mother's life miserable because she kept writing about this, I always found very, very unfair. But I think in the end, she was the wiser of the two, because she was less obsessed with the Holocaust than it came back, I think, to haunt my father. And my mother married again. She married another Holocaust survivor from Lodz. And he too was very, like, I don't know, he too was obsessed with what had happened. And I think my mother did eventually come to terms with it, which is not to say that she diminished it, but I didn't get the impression that it disturbed her dreams to the same extent as my father. My father had nightmares when I was a child, always.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever meet Jenya's adopted daughter?
I don't think Zenia has an adopted daughter.
Yeah. Okay. And I believe you said your grandmother survived the war. If so, did she get to see her mother's success as a writer?
Yes, up to a point. My grandmother died in 1959, so my mother's large works had not been published. But my mother had a large, great success as a poet. And that was really what got them into Canada, right? She was sponsored by the publisher of her Yiddish poetry in Montreal, a man named Harry Hirschman. And so my grandmother was very aware of my mother's success. And my mother used to say that her mother would sit there and look very proudly and boast to her friends about her Tochter, mein Tochter, the Dichter, my daughter, the poet. And so in that sense, yes, but my grandmother didn't live long enough to see the success of the trilogy. She was long dead by then.
And I think this is going to have to be our last question. As somebody who has translated so much of your mother's work, what do you hope readers take away from this collection of letters?
That's a good question. You know, I haven't really thought about it. I would like people to read the letters to know what it was like, to try to accommodate yourself to a new reality after having lived through what they both lived through. And certainly what to me, I said there were a number of surprises. And one of the surprises is just the early life in Canada, which I remember as a child, but the difficulties of their lives, of trying to, first of all, with language, and then with earning a living, and then just adapting to a different culture. It's not easy, and most immigrants do have to deal with that. But I think in the case of these two women, and what makes this collection, I think, important, is that they are also dealing with trauma in their past, right? That they have to somehow come to terms with in surroundings that are completely alien to both of them at first. And then, of course, obviously with time, they get adjusted. And but I think the difficulty of life, of worrying. My mother, when she's still in Belgium, she does not know French. She's in Brussels, right? And she has to, she doesn't want to, she wants to go to Germany with my father because she thinks she could get into university there, because German and Yiddish are not that far apart. And she knew German. French was like, you know, a new country. But then, since she learns French in Brussels, it also helps her to feel a little bit more at home in Montreal. And so there are all these things that come together. And mostly it's the life I've lived all my life in Canada, the experience of being deracinated, right? Of having to adopt to a new language and a new culture and a new reality. That's not mine. But it is both of these women's.
Well, once again, amazing work, Goldie, and thank you for your work bringing this out, as well as all of the other work that you've translated, and getting these stories out there to us. And in this case, these letters, which bear so much in terms of the reality and the rawness of what they experienced. So thank you. I hope we see you again soon. Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year. I get you.
Thank you all for joining us this evening as well. I hope that you will join us Thursday, October 9th at 7 p.m. for Mikołaj Grinberg, Jewish Poland Today on Page and Screen. And if you're in the area or considering a trip to New England for the fall foliage, please join us at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst on Sunday, October 27th for our open house from 10 to 4, a day of free events in celebration of the launch of our visually stunning 350-page color exhibition catalog, Yiddish: A Global Culture, Bold Lives, Boundless Creativity, and also to mark the second anniversary of the exhibition opening. We have lots planned, some surprises, some posted, including a special program at 2 p.m. yiddishbookcenter.org/events for full details and to register for all of our events. Thanks to our producer, Elizabeth Carteropoli-Dearden, who makes all of the programming run so smoothly from behind the scenes. And again, a huge thanks To all of our members, your support makes all of our work possible. To learn more about how you can support the Yiddish Book Center or become a member if you're not currently, visit yiddishbookcenter.org and see the full calendar of events, learn about our in-person programs, and see when we're visiting at cities around the country. Until then, wishing you a Happy New Year and look forward to welcoming you back to our virtual theater and in person to the center in Amherst, Massachusetts. Until then, have a good evening.